Welcome back. We're on the final stretch today. Last session, we continue our study of Daniel chapter 9, and we're going to deal now with the decree that begins the 70-week prophecy as well as the 2,300-day prophecy. So let's have a word of prayer, and we'll jump right into our study. Father in heaven, as we begin this session, as we do at every session, we plead for your presence. We ask that you will enlighten our minds, that you will open our hearts, that you will give us understanding. Not only that, but that you will give us the passion to use this knowledge to share with those who are searching for the truth. There are thousands upon thousands, perhaps millions out there that serve you the best they know how, but they don't have the full light, the full knowledge of what you want them to know. Help us to find them and to share with them. We thank you for the privilege of being here, and we ask for your presence. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, we're going to begin on page 476 in volume 2 of our study notes. We continue our study of the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And the first thing that we're going to look at is the starting date for the 70 weeks and also the 2,300 days. Gabriel began his explanation of the 70 weeks with the following words. From the going forth of the word, the NIV says decree, the contemporary English version command, the King James version commandment, to restore and to build Jerusalem. Now we want to deal with 3 particular points. Number 1, what is the proper translation of the word dabar? It's translated word, going forth of the word. What does the word dabar mean? The second point that we want to deal with is when did the word to restore and build Jerusalem go forth? So when was this uttered by King Artaxerxes? And number 3, what is the meaning of restoring and building Jerusalem? So this is the first thing that we're going to deal with this afternoon in this last session. Number 1, what is the proper meaning of dabar, which is translated word? Secondly, when did the word to restore and build Jerusalem go forth? First go forth. And what is the meaning of restoring and building Jerusalem? Let's begin with the meaning of the word dabar, which is translated word. The word dabar appears frequently in the Old Testament, and its usual and proper translation is word. However, we must take the context where it appears into account. Is the translation word the best in the context of Daniel 9? There are several instances in the Old Testament where dabar refers to a royal decree or command. For instance, Isaiah 45 verse 23 links the word with an oath. And a word with an oath takes the form of a what? Of a royal decree. Esther 1:19, the word is used in the sense of a royal commandment incorporated into the law code of the Medes and Persians, and the royal commandment was that Vashti should never again appear before the king. That was not a simple word. That was a command that was placed in the code of law of the Medo-Persian Empire. In Ezra 7:13, Artaxerxes gave a word or a royal decree that authorized the Jews to restore their civil and religious life. Ezra 7 verse 13 does not use the identical word dabar as did Daniel. And the reason is because Ezra was written in Aramaic and Daniel 9:25 was written in Hebrew. Nevertheless, the words are synonymous. The Aramaic word is repeatedly used in the Aramaic portion of Daniel That's Daniel 2, verse 4 through 7:27. And it's used also in Ezra in the sense of a royal decree. And you can find all of the references there in the book of Ezra where it refers to a royal decree. So a better translation is decree, the NIV, or commandment, the contemporary English version, or command in the contemporary English version, or commandment in the King James Version. Now the word dabar appears 2 verses earlier in Daniel 9:23. So if it appears 2 verses earlier, it might help us understand what it means in this particular instance. There, God gave Gabriel a dabar, or a command, to explain the 70 weeks to Daniel. Thus, in Daniel 9:25, we have a horizontal loyal command, Artaxerxes to the Jews. And in Daniel 9:23, the decree or command is vertical, God to Gabriel. So in Daniel chapter 9, verse 25, the word dabar should best be translated a royal decree or a command. And you'll notice that the royal command gives us the beginning of the date for the 70-week prophecy. Notice the formula. From the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. That gives us the beginning point, right? But it also gives us the ending point because it says, until Messiah the Prince. Are you following me or not? Yes. So in other words, it gives us the beginning point, the going forth of the command, and it's until the coming of Messiah the Prince. So we know when the 70 weeks begin, and we know the event that reveals when they will end. We have a beginning point, and we have an ending point. Now, there are 4 possible decrees that have been looked at as fulfilling Daniel 9 and verse 25. There is a chart here in our study notes at the end of this chapter that illustrates the 4 decrees. Now, the first is the decree of Cyrus the Great in 536 BC. This decree cannot be the date that begins the 70 weeks for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, a beginning date of 536 BC does not fit with the events of the final week. The final week points to 3 events: the anointing of the Messiah, his death, and the close of probation for the Hebrew theocracy. 483 years, that's 69 weeks, after 436 BC would only take us to the year 53 BC. Far too early for the arrival of the Messiah to fulfill this prophecy. Are you understanding this point? So the decree of Cyrus doesn't work chronologically, because if we took that date, 536 BC, that means the Messiah would have come in the year 53 BC. It doesn't work. Second, both Ezra 1, 2 through 4, and 2 Chronicles 36, verse 23, make clear that Cyrus's decree did not authorize the restoration and rebuilding of Jerusalem. It only authorized the building of the temple. So in other words, the decree of Cyrus doesn't fit with restoring and building Jerusalem. But there's a little problem. How then do we explain Isaiah 44, verse 28, and chapter 45, verse 13, where the prophet predicted that Cyrus would give a decree to rebuild the city? Now notice that Ezra 1, 2 through 4, and 2 Chronicles 36, 23 tell us that there was only an authorization to build the temple. But Isaiah 44, 28 and 45, 13 tells us that Cyrus would give a decree to rebuild the city. How do we solve this apparent problem? The answer is that these verses predict the beginning of a process that ultimately culminate in the building and restoration of the city, because the Bible doesn't contradict itself. In other words, Cyrus began the process of the rebuilding of the city and the reestablishment of the Jewish theocracy. Ezra and 2 Chronicles give us the actual decree, and nothing in the decree refers to the rebuilding of the city. So the decree itself does not authorize the rebuilding of the city. It's only Isaiah that says it, and Isaiah is prophesying about the beginning of a process that will culminate in the building and the restoring of Jerusalem. Finally, for the sake of argument, even if Cyrus had given a decree to rebuild the city, which he did not, it would still not fulfill the specifications of the prophecy of Daniel 9:25, because the prophecy requires a decree not only to rebuild Jerusalem, but to restore Jerusalem. We're going to discuss that more fully a little bit later on. As we shall see later, restoring and building are two distinct yet related ideas. Cyrus never gave a decree to build a city or to restore Jerusalem. There's a second decree. This is a confirmatory decree of Darius I in the year 520 BC. This is not Darius the Mede, who conquered the city of Babylon. This is Darius, he's known as Darius the Persian, or Darius I. Neither does this decree fulfill the specifications of Daniel 9:25. The extant biblical evidence indicates that when Cyrus gave the decree, many of God's people returned to Jerusalem with great enthusiasm to begin rebuilding the temple. The story is in Ezra chapter 2. They quickly laid the foundation of the temple, and then the Samaritan opposition halted the work. Because of the opposition, this is Ezra chapter 4 and verses 1 through 5, the people got discouraged and suspended the work and focused on their own personal affairs. The book of Haggai, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, describes this period. For over 15 years, the temple remained with a foundation only. However, in the year 520, Darius I reaffirmed the decree of Cyrus, the decree that Cyrus had given in the year 536, and the people resumed the building project. In other words, this was not a new decree. This was a confirmatory decree that allowed them, after the opposition of the Samaritans, to continue rebuilding the temple. Even a cursory reading of this decree reveals that it was simply a reconfirmation of the decree of Cyrus. It gave only permission to rebuild the temple, not the city. This shows that the decrees of Cyrus authorized the rebuilding of the temple under the wise leadership of Zerubbabel, Joshua, Zechariah, and Haggai. The people, awakened from their slumber, resumed the rebuilding of the temple and finished it in only 5 years, according to Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 15. So the preponderance of the biblical evidence shows that the decree of Cyrus in 536 and the confirmatory decree of Darius I in the year 520 dealt only with the rebuilding of the temple. Isaiah was saying that the process of restoring and building Jerusalem would begin with the decree of Cyrus, but it would continue until finally the city was built and rebuilt and restored. Then we have the decree of Artaxerxes I in 457 BC. This is the decree of Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25. This is the only decree that fulfills the specifications of Daniel 9:25. As we have seen, neither the previous two decrees gave permission for the Jews to rebuild and restore the city. The decree of Artaxerxes says nothing about the actual rebuilding of the temple. You can read it. It's in Ezra chapter 7. You can read the entire chapter. There's a decree. It says nothing about rebuilding the temple. Rather, it states that Artaxerxes gave gifts for the temple which had already been rebuilt. There's a long list of the gifts that Artaxerxes gave for the embellishing of the temple, if you please. Ezra wrote that this was the third decree given by Persian kings. Why would this be the third decree given by Persian kings? What was the first one? Cyrus in 536. What was the second one? Darius the first in the year 520. So this would be the third, right? The Bible itself tells us that in Ezra 6, verses 14 and 15. As noted before, the first two do not meet the specifications of Daniel 9:25. So we must take a closer look at this third decree in Ezra 7, verses 11 to 26. And also, you need to read Prophets and Kings, page 610, where we find an amplification of this. Now, before we examine the decree itself, we must determine the date when it was given. And the evidence points unmistakably to the year 457 BC. This date, which is found in Ezra 7 and 8, the 7th year of King Artaxerxes, tells us that the decree was given in the fall of his 7th year. This date is one of the most firmly rooted dates in Persian history. The work of Siegfried Horn and Kenneth Wood, the book titled The Chronology of Ezra 7, provides ample evidence for the reliability of this date. Regarding the date, Old Testament scholar and friend Angel Manuel Rodriguez summarized the evidence. The 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes is a well-established date in ancient history. According to Greek sources, Xerxes, the father of Artaxerxes, died during the last part of 465 BC. An Egyptian astronomical text suggests that he died between December and the Persian New Year in the spring. Babylonian astronomical texts and papyrus documents found in the island of Elephantine in Egypt confirm the fact that Artaxerxes ascended to the throne in 465 BC. That was his accession year, the year that he came onto the throne. His first full year as king began in the spring of 464 BC, when the new year started. Artaxerxes' 7th year thus would be when? 457 BC. He continues. Some have suggested that during the post-exilic period, the Jews used a spring-to-spring calendar, and that consequently the 7th year of the king would be 458 BC. The biblical evidence points to the opposite conclusion. Studies made in the chronology of the kings of Judah indicate that the civil calendar used in Jerusalem ran from fall to fall. This was also the case during the exilic period and during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And there, look up those verses. There it is. Ezra's calendar was a fall to fall one, making the 7th year of Artaxerxes 457 BC. So this date is firmly rooted in history, and it is the fall of the year 457 BC. Why is that important? That would mean that Jesus was baptized when? He was baptized in the fall. And he was crucified when? In the spring. And so when would the stoning of Stephen be? It would be in the fall. Are you with me or not? It would be in the fall. Everything fits absolutely perfectly. Now let's examine the decree itself. Daniel 9:25 requires that the decree accomplish two tasks: restore and build Jerusalem. In our discussion below, we will see that the meaning of the words restore and build are related, but not identical. The word build refers to the actual physical construction of the city, while restore refers to the reestablishment of the civil and religious governance of the city according to the specifications of the law of Moses. So to build means rebuilding the physical city with brick and mortar, if you please. Restore means to restore its civil and religious governance, because it does no good to build the city unless the city has its own self-governance. The decree of Artaxerxes authorized Ezra to reestablish the theocratic governance of Israel by appointing, I'm going to read this in a moment, by appointing magistrates and judges to judge the people according to the law of God. No longer according to the laws of Medo-Persia, according to the law of whom? Is this a reestablishment, a restoration of the theocracy? Yes. And to punish violations. Let's read it in Ezra chapter 7. And I'm not going to read the entire passage. I'm going to read only from verse 24 through verse 26. This is the decree of Artaxerxes. The word, the going forth of the word of Daniel 9, verse 25. Here is what the king said to Nehemiah. Also, we inform you that it shall not be lawful to impose tax, tribute, or custom on any of the priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, Nethinim, or servants of this house of God. And you, Ezra, according to your God-given wisdom, set what? Oh, magistrates. And what else? And judges, who may judge all the people who are in the region beyond the river, all such as know the laws of your God, and teach those who do not know them. Whoever, now notice, also penalties can be imposed. Is this a restoration of the theocracy? Self-governance? Absolutely. Whoever will not observe the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily on him, whether it be death. Even the death decree could be executed. Even by death, whether by death or banishment or confiscation of goods or imprisonment. So, what does it mean to restore Jerusalem? It means for them to have their self-governance back in civil matters as well as in religious matters. Now, there's been some discussion in scholarly circles about the textual location of Ezra 4, 7 to 23. They say that Ezra 4, 7 to 23 somehow was put in the wrong place in the book of Ezra, because they believe that Ezra chapter 4, verse 7 to 23 is talking about this decree of Artaxerxes. But it's not talking about this decree of Artaxerxes. It's referring to the same decree that Cyrus gave for the rebuilding of the temple. Let's pursue this. This passage tells us, the passage of Ezra 4, 7 to 23, that in the early reign of Artaxerxes, that would be 457 BC, the 7th year of his reign, although this decree is not from that time period. This passage tells us that in the early reign of Artaxerxes, he made a decree for the returned exiles to build and restore Jerusalem. However, when the Hebrew exiles were in the process of rebuilding the city, Bishlam, Mithredath, Tabeel, and their Samaritan companions sent a letter to Artaxerxes, complaining that the Jews were building the rebellious and bad city and have set up the walls thereof and joined the foundations. However, this was a slanderous and hyped up accusation cooked up by their enemies. The Samaritans requested that Artaxerxes put a halt to the endeavor, supposedly for the good of the kingdom. All this is in chapter 4. But this is not dealing really with this period of history that scholars say it is. Let's continue. In response, Artaxerxes sent a letter to the Samaritans telling them to compel the Jews to halt the work. And this the Samaritans did, and pronto. According to the King James Version translation, Artaxerxes left the door open for a possible future decree. Artaxerxes wrote to the Samaritans, "Cause these men to cease, and that this city shall not be built until another commandment shall be given from me." Here's a very important point. The word "another" is not in the Hebrew text. There's no inkling that Artaxerxes would give another decree. So what's happening is that the scholars believe that Ezra chapter 4 actually belongs where Ezra chapter 7 is. And that the word that is used here in the King James Version, "until another commandment is given," that would be after 457, Artaxerxes gave a decree in 444. And that was the additional decree that supposedly was given. Now, let's continue. The word "another" is not in the Hebrew text. The translators of the King James Version inserted the word because they believed that Artaxerxes had already given a decree in 457 BC, authorizing the city to be rebuilt, and left the door open possibly for another, which supposedly would be in 444. We're going to talk about the 444 decree a little bit later on. Are you understanding this point or not? Okay. According to this view, it is highly unlikely that the Jews would have begun building the city without a royal decree. Those who hold this view believe that the decree of 457 was the original decree given by Artaxerxes, authorizing the rebuilding of the city by the Jews. However, after he gave the decree in 457, the enemies of the Jews, alarmed by the idea that the Jews would possibly function as a theocracy once more, sent a slanderous letter to the king, which led him to suspend the original decree until the matter could be further reviewed. In this view, the suspension of the decree lasted until the 20th year of Artaxerxes. All this time, Jerusalem remained in ruins. In 444 BC, Nehemiah described the deplorable condition of the city in a letter to Artaxerxes. "The city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire." It is noteworthy that the city was still in ruins in 445 BC. The assumption held by those who have the present view is that Artaxerxes gave the original decree to build and restore the city in 457 BC. The slanderous accusations by the Samaritans led Artaxerxes to suspend the decree until 444, when Artaxerxes gave a second decree which authorized Nehemiah to resume the rebuilding. Are you with me or not? Now, however, there is a second view that is spelled out in detail in an article by Gerard Darmstadt in appendix number 5 of your study notes. I called him personally and asked him for permission to include it in the study notes. And I'm going to synthesize now from the Spirit of Prophecy how Dr. Darmstadt understood this, and it's confirmed by Ellen G. White. There's a second view. What is the second view? The second explanation hinges on the idea that the Artaxerxes in Ezra 4 is not the same Artaxerxes who gave the decree in 457 BC, but rather a usurper called False Smyrtus. And I say, well, that's a stretch. No, it isn't. Let's continue. So the argument is that the Artaxerxes in Ezra 4 is not the same Artaxerxes who uttered the decree in 457 BC, but rather a usurper called false Smerdis. The name Artaxerxes, this is important, the name Artaxerxes is not a proper name, but rather a dynastic name that was used by several rulers of the Persian Empire. You can see it in the chart at the end of the study notes. A whole group of Persian kings are called Artaxerxes. This is important. Ellen White agreed with this second view. Notice what she wrote. This is a long quotation, but very important. Prophets and Kings 572 and 573. This was a wonderful opportunity for the Jews. The highest agencies of heaven were working on the hearts of kings, and it was for the people of God to labor with the utmost activity to carry out the decree of Cyrus. This decree is from the period of what king? Cyrus, not Artaxerxes. It continues. They should have spared no effort to restore the, what? The temple and its services, and to reestablish themselves in their Judean homes. But in the day of God's power, many proved unwilling. The opposition of their enemies was strong and determined, and gradually the builders lost heart. Some could not forget the scene at the laying of the cornerstone, when many had given expression to their lack of confidence in the enterprise. And as the Samaritans grew bolder, those are the opposition, many of the Jews questioned whether, after all, the time had come to rebuild. The feeling soon became widespread. Many of the workmen, discouraged and disheartened, returned to their homes to take up the ordinary pursuits of life. You can read this whole story in the book of Nehemiah. It's there. Now notice, during the reign of Cambyses, the work of the temple progressed slowly. Is this talking about the building of the city? No. The work on the temple progressed slowly. And during the reign of the false Smerdis, and then she includes, called Artaxerxes in Ezra 4, verse 7. Are you following me? So once again, during the reign of Cambyses, by the way, Cambyses reigns after Darius the First. It's the period of the rebuilding of the temple. During the reign of Cambyses, the work on the temple progressed slowly, and during the reign of false Smerdis, called Artaxerxes in Ezra 4, verse 7, the Samaritans induced the unscrupulous impostor to issue a decree forbidding the Jews to rebuild their temple and city. So Cambyses gives a decree, you're to stop rebuilding the temple. And let me ask you, was there a second decree after this that authorized the rebuilding of the temple? Yes, by Darius the First. So are you following me? Okay. Now, let's continue here. Several details in this significant statement indicate that Ezra 4, 7-23 was not inserted in the wrong place, because it's dealing with an earlier period of Artaxerxes. It's not the same period as Ezra 7. Several details in this significant statement indicate that Ezra 4, 7-23 was not inserted in the wrong place. Ellen White explicitly wrote that the Artaxerxes of this passage ruled in the period of Cyrus, Cambyses, and false Smerdis between 536 and 515 BC, not during the two decrees of Artaxerxes I from 457 to 444. We shall have more to say about the second decree of Artaxerxes I when we consider the meaning of the words street and wall in Daniel 9:25, but now let's turn to the possible fourth decree. The decree of Artaxerxes I, this is the same Artaxerxes that in his 7th year gave the decree that we found in Ezra 7. Now this is the 20th year of his rule. 13 years have passed since the first decree. This wasn't a decree at all. It simply gave Nehemiah personal permission to go to Jerusalem and lead out in the task of rebuilding the city and the wall. This was not a new decree, but rather a reaffirmation of the decree that Artaxerxes had given in the year 457 BC. Nehemiah 2, chapter 2 through chapter 6 describes the fascinating story of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The narration begins with Nehemiah downcast because the city, and I quote, lies waste and the gates are burned with fire. When Artaxerxes saw Nehemiah's grief, he asked why he was so downcast. Nehemiah explained that the reason was the condition of his beloved city. Remember, this happening in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. The king then asked Nehemiah what was his request. Nehemiah had longed for the king to ask this question. So he said to the king, "Send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it." In response, the king gave Nehemiah letters of authorization to return to Jerusalem to lead the task of rebuilding the city and the wall, and he provided Nehemiah with an escort. Chapters 2 through 6 describe the rebuilding of the walls and the gate in the midst of constant opposition by Sanballat, Tobias, and Geshem. These men and their sympathizers used every stratagem in their arsenal in an attempt to impede the work of rebuilding, but their every plot was disarmed. The result of the work was extraordinary. The wall and gates were finished in only 52 days. However, what happened after the wall was finished is of equal importance as the building of the wall itself. What had Artaxerxes authorized? Not only the rebuilding of the city and the wall, he had authorized what? The restoring of the governing system, of the religious system. What happens immediately after the wall is finished and the building of the city? Well, when the construction ended, genealogical records were set straight. The book of the law was read at the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. The history of Israel was reviewed, and the covenant was renewed. The covenant ritual was restored. The land was restored and returned to those to whom it belonged. And various violations of the book of the law were corrected. Is this an indication that they're reestablishing their entire religious system? Absolutely. All of these actions in Nehemiah 7 to 13 constitute a restoration of the Hebrew theocracy in harmony with the laws of God. And we also notice that Artaxerxes, in his decree in Ezra 7, had authorized the election of magistrates and governors and judges, etc. Now let's continue the next paragraph. No doubt there were still some things that needed to be corrected. Malachi describes some of these. And no doubt the enemies of Israel continued to offer their opposition. However, by the year 408 BC, the city and the wall had been fully rebuilt, and the theocracy's civil and religious system was in full force. These are the 7 weeks that are spoken of in the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Remember, it's 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The 7 weeks have to do with the rebuilding of the city and the wall, whereas the 62 weeks added to 7, 69 weeks, take us all to the time of the Messiah. The 49 years between the giving of Artaxerxes' decree in 457 BC and the completion of the building and restoring of Jerusalem in 408 were certainly turbulent and troublous times, such as Daniel 9 indicates. Does it say that the city and the wall would be rebuilt in troublous times? Absolutely. It was a tumultuous time, the rebuilding of the city and the wall, constant opposition. Now, we need to underline one more point. The permission that Artaxerxes gave to Nehemiah did not fulfill the decree of Daniel 9:25. In other words, the decree of Artaxerxes that begins the 70 weeks cannot begin in 444 BC. You say, why not? For chronological reasons. As we shall see, the prophecy of the 70 weeks specified that the Anointed One would come 483 years after the decree was given, correct? If we begin the 483 years in 444 or 45 BC, the Messiah would have been baptized in which date? 37 AD. No scholar has ever suggested that Jesus began his public ministry in AD 37. A 445 or 444 beginning date would mean that Jesus would have been crucified in 41 AD. Way too late. And Stephen would have been stoned in the year 44 AD. The dates simply do not fit the historical data. In conclusion, there were 4 decrees related to the return of the Jews after the exile. 2 of them were original decrees, and 2 were simply confirmatory decrees. And you have a summary at the top of page 484. 536 BC, an original decree by Cyrus to rebuild the temple, which was suspended by the Artaxerxes, who is false Smyrtus, in the year 522 BC. 520 BC, the confirmatory, by the way, false Smyrtus was killed after only 7 months. The usurper was killed. The confirmatory decree of Darius I confirmed Cyrus's decree and revoked the suspension of false Smyrtus. 457 BC, an original decree of Artaxerxes I to restore and build Jerusalem, but the people didn't get down to business. In 444 BC, the city was still in ruins, and the wall was torn down. And so Nehemiah said, and the king sees, he says, what's up? He says, well, my city is desolated. And so Artaxerxes says, well, let me give you now permission. It's not even a decree. He says, go to Jerusalem and start the process of rebuilding the city and the wall. Are you with me or not? It's a confirmatory decree of the one that he gave in 457, which the Jews had not paid any attention to. Everybody was concerned more about their own home, if you read the words that are found in the book of Haggai. Now, let's talk about to restore and build Jerusalem. Daniel 9:25 refers to a royal decree to restore and to build Jerusalem in that particular order. Are the words restore and build synonymous, or do they describe different tasks but related one to the other? In 1995, a very helpful book was published by the Adventist Theological Society by Brempong Owusu Antwi. The book is titled The Chronology of Daniel 9:24 to 27. I don't know if it's still available. I have it in my library. In this publication, the author provided some valuable information on the meaning of the words restore and build. And I've synthesized the vast material that he presented in his book in a brief way in the following paragraphs. In order to understand the meaning of restoring and building Jerusalem, we must first consider the meaning of the word Jerusalem. You say, well, why do you have to understand the meaning of Jerusalem? Jerusalem is Jerusalem, right? Well, let's notice. Frequently, when the Bible speaks of Jerusalem, it is not describing a physical city composed of bricks and mortar, but rather to the city as a polis, in other words, as an organized society that is living, social, religious, and political entity composed of people, commerce, rulers, magistrates, judges, and civil and religious laws, an organized government of the city, both religiously and civilly. In order for the city to function as a polis, as an organized city with its own self-governance, it needs to be organized as such. The captivity of Jerusalem involved far more than the destruction of the physical city. Would that be true? That the captivity was much more than just the destruction of the physical city? Of course. What else was destroyed? The governance of the city. No longer magistrates, no longer judges, no longer a king. So it wasn't only the physical city, it was the self-governance. So the captivity of Jerusalem involved far more than the destruction of the physical city. In actual fact, Jerusalem lost its governance before the city was actually destroyed. You say, really? Yeah. Daniel 1:1-3 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem in 605 BC, besieged it, and took King Jehoiakim and all the royal seed and all the princes captive. Is that when the self-governance of the city comes to an end? Absolutely. Thus, Jerusalem lost her political autonomy or her right to self-governance and became subservient to what kingdom? To Babylon. Although the physical city was not destroyed at this time, the 70-year captivity of Jerusalem began, because it wasn't only the destruction of the city, it was the loss of self-governance as an independent nation. The captivity of Jerusalem began 19 years before the physical city was destroyed. Of course, we know that in 586 BC, the city itself was destroyed. The land was laid waste, the religious services ended, and the remaining political and military leaders were taken captive to Babylon. At this point, Jerusalem had a double problem. She lost her political religious autonomy, and the physical city was in ruins. So did the city have two problems? Well, of course it did. The city was totally in ruins, and therefore, along with that, it no longer had a government. It could no longer govern itself according to God's laws or according to civil laws. Jeremiah 25:11 had prophesied that the whole land was to be a desolation and astonishment, and the nations, including Israel, would serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. 2 Kings 24 describes the destruction of the city and the temple. 2 Kings 24:14 and 15 describes the aftermath of the destruction. And he, that is Nebuchadnezzar, carried away all Jerusalem. Boy, he must have had a real good cart to carry away Jerusalem. How is Jerusalem used here? It's talking about the political entity of Jerusalem. It's not talking about the physical city. Didn't Jesus say the same thing? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets. So the physical city of Jerusalem destroyed the prophets, right? It was the people. It's the people. And so once again, he, Nebuchadnezzar, carried away all Jerusalem. What does it mean to carry away Jerusalem? And all the what? Princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths, none remain, save the poorest sort of the people of the land, and he carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, the king. What happened with Jerusalem? It was destroyed as a physical city, but its governance, religiously and civilly, was gone. So what would need to happen if they were going to be restored? You would not only have to build Jerusalem, you would have to restore it as well. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar did not carry away the physical city. Jerusalem here refers to the socio-political religious entity composed of kings, officers, military men, and craftsmen, like we just read. In fact, Daniel himself attributed the loss of self-governance and the destruction of the city to the apostasy of the kings, princes, fathers, and judges. Now, in order for Jerusalem to be reestablished as she was before the captivity, two things needed to happen. First, her political, religious self-determination needed to be restored, and the physical city needed to be built. These two tasks, though related, are not identical. The word build refers to the reconstruction of the physical city. On the other hand, the word restore means to give back to or to return to a condition that existed before. Are you understanding this? Crucially important. What is King Artaxerxes saying in this decree, in this royal decree, that they can now return to build and to restore Jerusalem? He's saying, you can go back and you can build the city, you can build the wall, you can live there, you can reestablish your political and your religious self-governance. Is that what the decree says in Ezra chapter 7? That's exactly what the decree says. We need to keep this in mind. So, is what we have studied clear? Now, in our next class, we are going to examine the meaning of the word restore in other places of the Old Testament. And we're going to examine references to build. And we're going to see that this assessment that I've shared with you is a correct assessment of the words. We're going to find how after the captivity, the land was returned to Israel for them to rebuild the city, the wall, the temple, and to reestablish and rebuild their religious system. At the bottom of page 485, you see Judges chapter 11 and verse 13, 2 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 7. On the next page, 2 Kings 14 and verse 22, and 1 Kings 12:21, along with 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 3. There you find the meaning of the word restore. And it has to do with restoring the land in order to be able to rebuild. And then, of course, we're going to study about the coming of the Messiah, the Prince being cut off in the middle of the week. We're going to talk about the stoning of Stephen as the ending event of the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And we're going to connect this once again with the prophecy of the 2,300 days or 2,300 years. Is the belief of the Seventh-day Adventist Church based not only on Scripture but also on history? It most certainly is. This is not a revision of history. This is exactly the history that is portrayed in the book of Ezra, in the book of Nehemiah, and in the book of Haggai, which is describing the rebuilding of the temple and how it takes only 5 years to rebuild the temple when people get down to business. So, in our next class, tomorrow, at 9 o'clock in the morning sharp, we are going to continue our study of the prophecy of Daniel 9, and we'll dedicate 3 sessions to this.